During the month of June, as celebrations to commemorate the Juneteenth holiday begin, dozens of Black girls and women across the country will be competing for a singular title, Miss Juneteenth. Juneteenth, or Freedom Day, is rooted in the announcement of the emancipation for hundreds of thousands of African American slaves in Texas on June 19th in 1865. The day involves both the celebration of joy and the commemoration of pain. From pageants, federal legislation, and specialty foods, this little-known holiday is suddenly getting major attention. And sadly, the true facts about the day and the conditions of slaves in the U.S. are still obscured, distorted, and downright wrong. Today, we are asking why, and we are setting the record straight on the facts about Juneteenth. Here's a little known Juneteenth trivia before we get started. I'm asking today, who delivered the news to the slaves that they were free, and where did they deliver that news? Post your answers in the comments. Now, no Google searches allowed. Our historians will reveal the answers at the end of the first half of the show. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
On Tuesday of this week, the same United States Senate that refuses to pass comprehensive voting rights legislation and the George Floyd and policing law unanimously passed a law to make Juneteenth a federal holiday. The bill, whose passage comes days ahead of Juneteenth, which will be celebrated this Saturday on the 19th of June, still needs to pass the House. But it is a major step forward after a similar resolution had been blocked in recent years by Republican senators. Juneteenth commemorates the day in 1865 when news of the Emancipation Proclamation reached Black slaves in Texas, nearly 2 years after the proclamation had been issued by then President Abraham Lincoln. In June 2020, following widespread national protests against racial injustice, the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and other African American men and women who had lost their lives to police violence, big corporations embraced Juneteenth. From Twitter to Nike, Citigroup, Target, and Lyft, they began all recognizing the day. In contrast, African Americans, beginning in Texas, have celebrated June 16th since 1866. Today, I'm asking, why did it take literally 155 years for major corporations, most U.S. states, the United States Senate, major media outlets, and elected officials? In short, I'm asking white Americans, why did it take us so long to deem Juneteenth worth commemorating, given that it is a day that is, if not more, important to our nation as Independence Day? And why do so many people still get the facts about Juneteenth wrong? We're asking those questions and we're getting answers today. My first guest this morning is Dr. Treva Lindsay. She is a professor at Ohio State University, a noted race scholar and historian with a focus on African American women's history. She's also the author of multiple books, including Colored No More, Reinventing Black Womanhood in Washington, D.C. Good morning and welcome back to the show, Dr. Lindsay.
Thank you for having me, Areva.
You know, Dr. Lindsay, before the protest of last summer, following George Floyd's murder, following Breonna Taylor's murder, before we were having this whole big conversation about a racial reckoning and systemic racism, most people had never, ever heard of Juneteenth. So I want to ask you, you're a historian, why has this really important day been pretty much erased until recently from U.S. history?
Yes, I think that's a great question, Areva. So part of this is that some of this is within Black communities. There's this interesting way in which the practices, commemorations, traditions of African Americans in places, particularly in the US South, that are often ignored, unseen, untaught in our schools, that I would say a large majority of Americans, and again, this also includes a number of Black Americans as well, particularly outside of the South, who would have been unfamiliar with Juneteenth, let alone celebrated the holiday itself, because it commemorates something so specific with regards to white denial. And I want to echo a piece here written by my colleague, Brittany Cooper, who wrote this for the Crunk Feminist Collective, of thinking about Juneteenth being about white dishonesty. Because although the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed in January of 1863, that news, the freeing of enslaved people in the Confederate States, did not occur. And so it wasn't until the Union Army arrives in these southern parts of Texas that this proclamation is made, and these enslaved people know that they've had freedom actually for 2.5 years under the guise of the Emancipation Proclamation, but that's not actualized. So this holiday is not only about the convivial, joyous celebration of our ancestors, it's about an incredible history of white dishonesty that's linked to white supremacy and linked to this idea of maintaining the status quo of white domination over Black lives. And so I think there's a lot of discomfort, there's a lot of explicit energy to erase that history and to deny, even in 2020 and now 2021, the complicity and the active engagement of white people in maintaining the systems of racial slavery in the United States.
So you talk, Professor Lindsay, about denial and about the need to, in many ways, whitewash our history. And I can think of no bigger whitewash of history than the lie, let's just call it what it is, that we're told from little kids in school about Abraham Lincoln and why Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. You know, we're taught in history class to revere Abraham Lincoln as someone who, out the goodness of his heart, decided that slavery was wrong and he wanted to rid the entire country of slavery. Please help set the record straight about Abraham Lincoln and why that big lie is just that, a lie.
It's important to know that it's a lie because one of the things that does is erases the tremendous work of Black abolitionists, enslaved people, in fighting for their freedom in this nation, to contest, to push back against, to really run up against a nation that was deeply wedded to enslaving peoples of African descent in this nation, to keep this cheap labor force, and it's really this free, right, unpaid labor force, the exploitation, the extractive labor, the violence that comes along with chattel slavery in place for as long as that could be sustained. And so you have continuously, up until the Emancipation Proclamation, which in fact only abolishes or is set to emancipate enslaved people in the Confederate States, so states that had rebelled against the Union, not in Kentucky and Delaware, which in fact maintain enslaved people until December 18th of 1865, when the 13th Amendment is passed and ratified. And so, although Lincoln is a critic, he's really thinking about the nation, the future of this, does not view African Americans necessarily as equal citizens, is being pushed in many ways to consider Black lives mattering in full and equity. And it is important for us in this holiday to say the work, the tremendous work of enslaved people, of freedmen of color, freed women of color, freed people of color, to push for this to happen, to push the nation to actualize, perhaps for the first time, some portion of the ideals that it set aside for itself in the 1770s with the Declaration of Independence, that this is one taste of what independence might look like. And of course, we know soon after, a new era of racial terror, a new era of how we put Black folks in bondage, a masses that's different from chattel slavery, but still makes Black people dependent upon a state that has denied their humanity for hundreds of years.
Yeah, and I'm glad that Professor Lindsay, you talk about what the Emancipation Proclamation did, that it actually freed the slaves in the Confederate States. And those were the states that were the Union states, the Union Army and the Confederate Army were fighting. This was the Civil War. Obviously, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the Civil War, but historian Brenda Stevenson was on the show on Monday, and she wrote a piece where she said what was happening was that in 1862, the Union, the North, we think about the North and the South, the Union states in the North were losing the Civil War, and that Lincoln was trying to figure out a way to cut off the financial resources of the Southern states, i.e. the Confederate States. And one way of doing that was to end slavery in the Confederate States, because that would take away the free labor that you mentioned that the Southern states had, i.e. in slavery, those slaves who were picking cotton, and that cotton was being sold abroad to Great Britain and financing the Confederate Army and the Confederate military. That one way to diminish and to basically beat back the South was if you cut their legs off, cut off their resources. And you do that by taking away the free labor that slavery brought to the Confederate Army. How come we never talk about that in history? I mean, Dr. Stevenson, brilliant historian like yourself, laid it all out in an article that probably, I don't know, maybe 12 people, I'm one of them, that read. I'm sure, I don't know how many people read it, but I know I could count on one hand how many people probably have heard that account of why slavery was ended in the Confederate States. Because when we think about the Emancipation Proclamation to be true, we think, oh my God, all of slavery was ended by this, a proclamation.
Yes, I think we have to be honest about the dishonesty that we face when we talk about our history. And it is a bloodied, brutal, unkind, dehumanizing history that we're talking about. One entrenched in white supremacy, one entrenched in extracting labor through violence, through brute force, through creating a system in which one group, white folks, are dominant over Black folks upon stolen and occupied land, when we talk about Indigenous folks. And so I think when we look at what's happening right now alongside Juneteenth becoming a federal holiday, states rushing to ban critical race theory, the pushback against the 1619 Project, the pushback against thinking about curriculum that deals with racism, and thinking about discussing in honest ways the history of anti-Blackness, is that in not acknowledging that in-depth history that Dr. Stevenson laid out, that you laid out here, we get to remain heroic. We get to remain committed to these democratic ideals, as opposed to the reality that people fought this at every turn to maintain this system of racial slavery, to maintain this system of dominance, which post-Reconstruction, of course, is reorganized and reconstituted into systemized extra-legal racial terror, as well as Jim Crow, Black codes, and various other forms of racial violence. We were also commemorating Tulsa this year. There are numerous race riots that break out around this. So the condition of freedom that Black people are fighting for, that abolitionists and our allies are fighting alongside to produces the emancipation of enslaved people, but it doesn't produce a new context in which we reckon with the vestiges of white supremacy, which we're still doing today and debating. So while we have Juneteenth as this federal recognition, there is this reluctance to think about what history might tell us about ourselves and what we might not like in that history, and what might contradict our idealized self. And I mean that as a collective, as the United States, in terms of how we've treated people, in particular, how we've treated Black people across history.
Yeah, that's why it's so ironic that this Senate that will not pass comprehensive voting rights legislation, will not pass comprehensive police reform legislation, pass unanimously a federal holiday for Juneteenth. So recognizing Juneteenth as an important day on one hand, but yet denying primarily African Americans access to the ballot box and a police system that recognizes our humanity. I want to bring into the conversation now Professor Omikango Dabinga. He is a frequent guest on the Special Report. He's also expert on diversity and inclusion. He's a professor at American University. Good morning, Dr. Dabinga.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm great. And thanks for joining the conversation. So Dr. Lindsay has already helped us understand why this big lie is being told about Juneteenth. But there's another lie I want to set the record straight, and that is on the conditions of people who are freed because of the Emancipation Proclamation, because of the notice that's given to the slaves in Texas on June 19th, 1865. Help us understand what changed, if anything, for those 250 or so thousand slaves that were finally freed in 1865 in Texas.
Well, one of the challenges that we see during this time, and Dr. Lindsay nailed so much of this. It's really incredible that she started us off in this conversation properly. Is that many of these people who were enslaved and were now free, they had nowhere to go. So we saw the system of sharecropping develop. We saw people. We also, when we start talking about things relating to the 13th Amendment, and we talk about how people were freed with the exception of being incarcerated, right? We saw systems like convict leasing coming up. We also saw these states start to develop, and they already started before Texas. But once we saw that this happened on Juneteenth, they started to develop other systems in place, curfew systems, other types of ways to penalize people for being out on the streets, finding other ways possible to basically re-enslave those populations. Again, we had people who did not own their own land. They didn't have anywhere to go. They weren't given their freedom with a package of some sort to go and say, here, go start your business. There was no economic funds that were given in any way, shape, or form. So on many levels, they were only free in name, but they were still enslaved on many different levels. But having said that, we demonstrated such resiliency during this time period, doing the work to get out there and get our own land, get involved in the political system. I mean, it was during this time of Reconstruction that we had our first Black senators. And so even with every little opportunity that we had with freedom, we were working to take ourselves to the next level and fight. But unfortunately, that couldn't happen for the masses of people who gained their freedom. So on some levels, they were still enslaved.
Yeah, and it's really important, I think, for us to talk about that, Dr. Lindsay, because whether it's the Emancipation Proclamation or the 13th Amendment that you identified, which legally ended slavery in this country, laws can't change the hearts and minds of people. So we've had hundreds of years of white people believing that they were superior in all ways to African Americans. So now you have these millions of Black people that have been set free because of a change in the law, a change in policy. But what about the change in minds, the change in thoughts and beliefs about the innate inferiority of African Americans? Was there any efforts made after the Emancipation Proclamation, after the 13th Amendment, to start to change the belief system that had been developed and was deeply entrenched about how the inferiority of Black folks?
I would say at the systemic level, the simple answer would be no. I think what we see in the aftermath of emancipation and what are considered kind of the Reconstruction Acts, or the kind of first civil rights amendments that we think about, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, is that you see the uptick of incredible racial violence. You see the uptick of burning down the Black businesses that are built and created to serve these communities in lieu of not having access to other businesses. We built our own, our ancestors built our own, and they're attacked, they're lynched, they're raped, they're sexually assaulted. They are denied opportunities. And so Jim Crow realism is what sets in, even when we think about the kind of Reconstruction, emancipatory optimism that comes with a holiday like Juneteenth, the convivial thing. It's also, as Dr. DeBingham mentioned, this notion of resilience and creating something from nothing. And we were given less than nothing in the aftermath of this, in addition to a system, white supremacy, a structure of white supremacy, institutions built upon white supremacy that are built to deny the humanity of Black folks. And Black folks refuse that. We were never dehumanized. White supremacy dehumanizes white people in relationship to other groups. There were attempts to take everything away and keep us indebted to, in servitude to, in inferiority to white people, and Black people at every turn fought this, which is why you see the backlash, which is why you see the lynching, which is why you see the large scale violence in multiple cities, not just Tulsa, multiple cities and towns across the nation where Black people strove and created community from within themselves. So they were fighting a mentality as well as systems, structures, and institutions.
Can I add something to that?
No, absolutely. Go ahead.
Well, we have to understand that in addition to with your question, I should say, what actually was happening in terms of, was there an attempt to shift the mentality? The exact opposite was happening, because what we saw with these rich, white, powerful landowners, they saw that former enslaved Black people were actually working to rebuild the South with poorer white people, and they started to create an incentive structure to pull those poorer people who were white, to make them realize that this whiteness was really the goal. And so they started creating incentive structures to pull former enslaved people away from these poorer white people. And what you notice is that there were no Confederate statues built during the Civil War. They started to be created after the fact. And so we start to get things like Jim Crow statues starting to come up, because they were showing these poor people, no, you have more in common with us than you do with these former enslaved people. There's a line from the movie about Fred Hampton where Kaluuya says, what if the slaves and the poor white people got together and overthrew the slave masters? Where would we be today? And it was that type of mentality that still exists today that helped Trump get into office and do everything that he did in those 4 years, and what he's doing afterwards. The preservation of whiteness over everything else is what has been winning out for them.
Yeah, I think it's kind of remarkable when you look at the history of slavery in the U.S. and you just look at some of the statistics, the number of slaves versus the number of slave owners. I mean, it's such a huge difference. I think I read a statistic that said at one point there were like 20 million, people who were brought into slavery in the U.S. and there were like 350,000 slave owners. So, whether those numbers are completely accurate or not, the point is that there were far more people enslaved, and definitely far more enslaved people and poor people than there were slave owners and plantation owners and masters. What would have happened had those poor people, and we see Reverend Barber in the Poor People's Campaign talk about that religiously today. What if all people who are socioeconomically aligned, and that's most Black, brown, poor whites that live in places like Kentucky, realize that we have more in common than not, that we would be more powerful than the one percenters in this country. I do want to talk though, Professor Lindsay, about when we started to make this public recognition of Juneteenth. There's a state rep in Texas who started to really push for Texas in 1980, recognizing Juneteenth as a state holiday. His name was Al Edwards. He recently passed away, unfortunately, and he was a civil rights activist. He was in office for over 30 years in the state of Texas, and he was on the front lines fighting to make this a state holiday. And now we've seen states from New York to California who recognize Juneteenth as a holiday. California recognizes the third Saturday. I'm like, that's convenient. We recognize it on a Saturday. Somebody has to get a day off work, but whatever, California. People are hearing about Juneteenth in some ways, unfortunately, because of Donald Trump. We know, last year he planned a rally on Juneteenth in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and then went about the country bragging that he made Juneteenth popular. And, why is it, though, that it takes a Donald Trump type figure, big white corporations like Nike and Citicorp, to say something is important for America to then say it's important?
Well, I think Donald Trump likes to make sure Donald Trump is the center of every story that exists, when in fact, the story of 2020 is the uprisings that occur, is the spectacular examples of white supremacy on display with the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so forth and so on. We could go on with those names, that brings these companies seeing these uprisings happening amidst COVID, which disproportionately affects African Americans in this nation, which we see the disproportionate effect of what is and will be our eviction crisis, what will be a housing crisis, what will be a food insecurity crisis, a poverty crisis that we're bringing upon. And Black folks, again, are overrepresented in all of these categories in terms of those disparately impacted. And so what you see in this uprising, the people taking to the streets and saying no more, is that we are then looking for these ways to convene and figure out how we honor a history that led us to this point. So yes, Juneteenth is convivial and joyous. We're gonna have our tea cakes, our red velvet cake, our red food that we're gonna have on that holiday for those who celebrate. but it's also saying, look at what white supremacy continues to do. So while we have this symbolic moment of this federal recognition of the holiday, we can't get justice in our criminal punishment system. We can't get farmers. Black farmers just were on the way to some kind of reparative justice with regards to how they've been treated, and that's recently been taken away.
But Dr. Lindsay, I guess what I'm asking though is I'm frustrated about why though we're talking about Juneteenth today. We talked about Tulsa, Oklahoma, a month ago, but only because we were having this national reckoning around race in 2020. How do we get to a point in this country where we as Black folks who know about Juneteenth, have been eating tea cakes and celebrating Juneteenth since 1866, that we can elevate these important days and these important historical moments without waiting, without having to depend upon, without having, Nike, we don't need Nike to tell us that Juneteenth is important. Make tennis shoes, Nike, do whatever you do, but we don't need you to tell us that this is an important holiday.
And I think that Black folks have been celebrating, right? I was aware of Juneteenth. I think there are communities that are, but that elevation also tells us where our education system continues to, repeat and parrot white lies about Black history, that there are Black communities who are unaware of what emancipation looked like in these different spaces. And I think it's important to think about the regional component of Juneteenth, what it means specifically for Texans, as well as where the kind of Texas diaspora moves out into the world and throughout the US South and throughout the United States, to see where these celebrations pop off, where it has an ebb and flow in terms of that. We don't need white folks to validate Juneteenth for Juneteenth to be an important historical marker in the history of African Americans. It is, in fact, marking for us a particular moment for white supremacy as well. That I think this holiday also demarcates a particular moment in the history of white supremacy in this nation. So I think that that's what Nike and JP Morgan Chase and everyone else that'll now have Juneteenth sales, I suppose, to actually acknowledge about what this means for white supremacy in that long and enduring history. And for Black folks, it's this thing of resilience, of coming together, of Black congregation, of resistance, of dynamism. I think there can be kind of two or multiple ways that we engage Juneteenth now that it has this federal recognition, where I'm not diminishing the very real ways that Black communities have always been attuned to how we articulate and celebrate freedom.
And speaking of engaging, and Dr. Dabinga, how do we distinguish between those expressions of solidarity and gestures of absolution? Those white folks that say, see, I'm not a racist. I have a Twitter, post. I have an Instagram square. I have a Juneteenth sign on my lawn.
And we do get a lot of that, right? And what we have to do is we have to actively challenge people. What are you doing in your daily life to combat racism? Because if you are not actively doing something to end it, you are part of the problem. And hashtags and retweets and following this group or that is just not enough. You're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem. When you see something that's happened with George Floyd, say, oh, that's just terrible. Maybe he shouldn't have resisted and it was just wrong and Chauvin should go to jail, but then you do nothing after that. What are you doing to challenge your school board about the racist curriculum that's in your child's school? What are you doing to challenge your corporate colleagues to make sure that they're checking their hiring practice? Ending racism is not an event, it's a process. And so everybody out there who's sitting there saying, well, I've done this, I've done that, with a little bit of slacktivism by a retweet or a like, we're calling on them to do more. And I want to add also, when you talk about what Black people need to be doing more to control this narrative, we need to be doing what you're doing right now. We saw with the documentary a couple of weeks ago that came out on Greenwood, that was on CNN, who was it produced by? LeBron James and his cohort of people. Every single day we have an opportunity to take control of this media and put off the messages that we want. And we have to make sure that for the sake of our children's future, we're doing that, because in place of that, we have every single day that we see they're going to work to minimize and marginalize and disrespect our history. And so we have to tell them right now that just doing a little thing on social media is not enough. Just saying, oh, I'm happy we got Juneteenth is not enough. If you don't challenge the system in your daily life, you are part of the problem that we are seeking to destroy.
No, that's an excellent point. And about controlling the narrative, Dr. Lindsay, I'm just shocked at how many people get the facts wrong about Juneteenth. How many folks, including state legislators, I was reading some of the legislative history behind some of the laws that have been passed in states to make Juneteenth a holiday. And some of the governors and legislators in these states are reciting factually inaccurate information about what happened on June 19th in 1865. These are people with law degrees, people with PhDs, people with, the best education in this country. And I don't know if they're just being lazy, sloppy, just conflating a bunch of facts, Emancipation Proclamation, 13th Amendment, Juneteenth, just put it all together in a pot and just call it all the slaves were free. I'm not sure what's going on, but, can you just, again, recite as we're ending this segment in a very clear and precise way that a fifth grader can understand, including a governor that presumably has more than a fifth grade education, what Juneteenth is and what it is not.
All right, Juneteenth, here we go. Juneteenth 101. Let's write this down. So we'll start with the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863, right, which was ratified, which is this attempt by President Abraham Lincoln to be able to stop the kind of gains of the Confederacy, the Confederate states in the Civil War by cutting off this exploitative labor force known as chattel slavery, right? So they're like, we gotta get them less money. So let us emancipate enslaved people in the Confederate States, which at that point included about 10 states who were part of the Confederacy, including Texas. And there's not a strong Union Army presence in Texas at the time. So as the Union troops are gaining ground and moving down farther and farther south, in spite of the fact that enslaved people have technically been freed by the law in slaveholding states. So there are still border states like Kentucky and Delaware that have enslaved people who are going to be enslaved well into 1865, even after what we now know as Juneteenth, June 19th. So finally, on June 19th, Union General Gordon Granger reaches one of the southernmost parts of Texas, Galveston, Texas, and makes the proclamation that enslaved people are in fact free, right? And that happens on June 19th, 1865, right? And in subsequent times, right, beginning in 1866, we start to see Black communities, freedmen, gathering to celebrate the proclamation that had happened by Gordon Granger regarding slavery. We also see Juneteenth celebrated in Mexico in a particular community who were Black Seminoles who escaped slavery in the 1850s and also are aware of this proclamation. So you actually have Juneteenth that spreads. And as communities throughout the South broaden, people from Texas move out into other states and other cities, we start to see Juneteenth celebrations popping up all over the US South and eventually in other places throughout the nation who have connections to this history. It is not then until 1865, December 18th, in which the 13th Amendment, which officially abolishes slavery, except in the case of criminal punishment, in the United States, which formally then gets the rest of the enslaved people there who were in Kentucky and Delaware formally emancipated from slavery. And that is the official abolition of what we know as chattel slavery. So Juneteenth is a commemoration of that particular moment in the long history of abolishing slavery in the United States.
All right. Amen to that. That is Juneteenth 101. And if you want more about Juneteenth as well as the 13th Amendment, Ava DuVernay's documentary on the 13th Amendment is an outstanding documentary that gives you this entire history of what happened around slavery before the Emancipation Proclamation, after the Emancipation Proclamation, the whole history of the 13th Amendment. So for those history buffs and those that just want to have some good conversation at your next cocktail party, make sure you watch the 13th Amendment. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Lindsay, Dr. Domingo. You guys have just been phenomenal. Thank you for your tremendous work. Yeah, Dr. Domingo, you're so right. Controlling our narrative is the way that we ensure that our history is told and that it is told accurately. And the two of you are definitely helping us control our narrative. So again, thank you so much for joining me this morning. And I'm sure I'll be talking to you again because these issues about systemic racism and understanding its impact on our community, even to this day, won't be going away, unfortunately, anytime soon. So I'll be calling on both of you again. Thank you so much again for joining me.
Thank you.
All right, we're talking about the history of Juneteenth and the ways in which it is being celebrated and recognized today in this country. My next guest is Andrea Sledge. She served as chairperson and director of the, get this, the Miss Juneteenth pageant. Many of you probably didn't even know there was such a pageant. She was the director of that pageant in Fort Worth, Texas. These pageants, called Pageants with a Purpose, are growing in national prominence, and I'm happy to sit down this morning with Andrea. Good morning, Andrea.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's a pleasure.
Oh, great. You are in Texas, so you have been
am.
in with the history of Juneteenth and the celebrations that have been happening. And I think I shared with you before the show this morning, I'm reading the New York Times. I learn about you, and I learn about these pageants that have been happening over the last couple of years called Miss Juneteenth. Help us understand what the Miss Juneteenth pageants are all about.
Absolutely. So the beauty of the Miss Juneteenth pageant is that it is our opportunity as people of color to be able to pour into our young adults all of our rich history from over the years, from the emancipation of 1863 to the slaves being freed in Texas in 1865, to starting our celebrations in 1866. And what's important is to maintain one of the 12 freedoms gained. And one of the 12 freedoms gained is that we earn the right to preserve, learn our own history and to tell our own story and being committed to our truths. And that's exactly what the Miss Juneteenth pageant does. It is more than about these young ladies getting on stage, being absolutely beautiful. It is our opportunity to celebrate Black excellence at its finest and not have to worry about conformities of being in generalized mainstream pageantry, if you want to call it that. It is our opportunity for us to make sure that we constantly enrich our children and tell our stories. So that way, once all of us are gone, there's someone to carry on the legacy. So that way our history doesn't die, and because they're not going to do it in schools. So the responsibility lies with us, as the adults, as the individuals, as parents, as mentors, as, in church or whatever, but it belongs to us to keep our stories alive and very real. When you think about, the Black Lives Matter movement and, and everything that's happened over the last couple of years with this unprecedented number of innocent Black lives being taken, a lot of our children feel that their voices don't matter, that their voices don't have the right to be heard. But with the Miss Juneteenth pageant, we encourage our children differently. And what we let them know is that your voice matters. And, just like I told them in the New York Times, regardless of whatever room they walk into, they belong. And nobody has the right to make you feel some type of way about it either. You have something to offer to this world, but being true to your Blackness doesn't make you a racist. Right. It just means that you are committed to preserving your right as an African-American person, but also the plight of your ancestors, and to continue to tell their story.
So I know that, Andrea, you are a 12-time national and state pageant winner yourself. You have 12 titles under your belt. So you competed in pageants. And what I found that I loved and what resonated with me about the Juneteenth pageants was that one, like you just said, it's not about conforming. So you got girls of all shapes. So you think of the traditional beauty pageant, the girls are like 100 pounds, they are a size 0.
Right.
Your pageant, or the Juneteenth pageants, accepts girls all shapes, sizes,
Absolutely.
The perfect model figure. And also scholarships to historically Black colleges and universities. And as you said, education about the history of slavery in this country, the history of African Americans. Help us understand how long these pageants have been taking place, because honestly, I didn't know about these pageants. And I think a lot of my viewers didn't know that these pageants, were taking place in places like Texas and through other places throughout the country.
Right. So for Fort Worth, Texas, this is actually the 45th pageant. I took over about 3 years ago. I know, and when you think about 45 years of pageantry, you think, okay, this should be a very well-known, system. And unfortunately, it's not. But one of the things that I will say is that, yes, the popularity of Juneteenth was born out of truly unfortunate circumstances, right? But what it's also allowing inside of the Juneteenth community for all of us who are planners and, planning our pageants, we're finding that there are so many other pageants. So all of us kind of connecting together who really didn't know that each other existed. So there's this surge of excitement, about everything that's going on, especially with now that we have a national Juneteenth pageant. Finally. So now our girls are not just competing in Galveston or Fort Worth or in Delaware, Las Vegas, even in Oregon, believe it or not. And they actually get together to come to one space, to be able to compete for one coveted title, just like you would in your mainstream Miss USA, Miss America pageants. Right. And so we're really, really excited about that. So all that going on now is it's going to be phenomenal and wonderful.
Wow, I'm so excited to hear that 45 years of pageantry in Fort Worth, you taking over 3 years ago. And like you said, now the first national Miss Juneteenth. I love that you said in that article where you were quoted that this is a pageant where women can be unapologetically Black. They can
unapologetic.
Be they can have natural hair, and they don't have to fit into a mold. What an incredible message to send to young people at a time, like you said, when they feel like their lives are at stake, where they feel so vulnerable, where they feel like they're being attacked in pretty much every environment that they find themselves in. So I just want to congratulate you and all the creators and the sponsors and the folks that
thank you. Thank you so much.
Possible. How can a girl, somebody who's listening to this, who has a daughter, who would love to compete, how can they get involved and become a contestant in one of these pageants?
Sure, absolutely. So they can reach out to me and I can put them in connect with the correct people. So I can be reached at director@allworldbeauties.com, but you can also go to www.juneteenthftw.com and go under our pageant page, which has tons of information, which is actually going to be in line with exactly how the National Miss Juneteenth program is ran. So you can get some information there as well. But I would be more than happy to connect anyone who's trying to find a pageant in their state, or if they don't have one, we will find one for you.
Well, fantastic. We're definitely going to post those links so that people can get that information. And thank you so much for, again, reminding our Black girls that their Black is beautiful. And good luck to you in this year's pageant as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much. I really appreciate it.
Okay, take care.
You too.
All right, we've been talking about federal legislation. We've talked about beauty pageants. Now we're going to talk about food, because it wouldn't be Juneteenth without a celebration that includes lots of good soul food. My next guest is Chef Ray Anthony Barrett. He is the owner of Sing K Catering in Los Angeles, and he is celebrating Juneteenth differently this year. From my hometown of Missouri, good morning, Chef Ray, and welcome to the special report.
Good morning.
Thank you so much. I was reading about your way as a chef of celebrating Juneteenth. And when you think about Juneteenth, every year for the last 10 years or so, I've been going to a big celebration here in Los Angeles that had, lots of great music, dancing, but of course, good old-fashioned soul food. And, food is associated with a lot of holidays in the U.S., like turkey with Thanksgiving, black-eyed peas and greens at New Year's, particularly for African Americans. What is the traditional dish that is associated with Juneteenth?
It's red food and red drinks. So as Dr. Lindsay mentioned, like red velvet cake and, there's red soda was a luxury that the formerly enslaved couldn't appreciate. And it became something to use to celebrate, but it's also something to commemorate the bloodshed that was, spilled, the perseverance of the ancestors who tilled the the often red soil. So those are the traditions, you know. And I was listening to the program earlier, and you mentioned you're like, why is this such a big deal? Why, you know, are the corporations like starting to appreciate it? Why now? And I don't know. I was thinking about it, and it makes kind of aligns perfectly with the white supremacist history of this country. You know, it was built on corporations capitalizing on the exploitment and enslavement of Black bodies. So it only makes sense that, you know, they would exploit, you know, the emancipation of Black bodies.
Yeah,
So
kind of some sick irony in it. And as much as we know that when corporations do, you know, take interest in something, they have the money and they have the platform to elevate it in a way that otherwise, you know, we wouldn't see happen. So there's this, you know, this double-edged sword. You know, there's the good thing that's happening now is that more people are talking about Juneteenth. More families are sitting down talking about it. Hopefully more schools are talking about it. More people are being educated. But as you said, you know, it's only happening because apparently they figured out that there's something in it. And let's not be naive. That something is probably is money. There's
yeah,
some value. There's some monetary value in it for these corporations. Otherwise, we would not be having, you know, Juneteenth celebrations. You know, we just have to be honest about that. But we have to accept that the good thing is we're at least talking about it, you know,
yeah.
despite what we know to be the motives of these corporations. I do want to ask you, though, about one of the dishes that you are cooking this year in celebration of Juneteenth, and it's Hoppin' John.
Yeah.
What is Hoppin' John, and why Hoppin' John on Juneteenth?
Well, Hoppin' John is you know, you mentioned black eyed peas and greens on New Year's. It's black eyed peas, greens, smoked pork, and rice. And it's a dish that you know, made its way from the west coast of Africa. You know, they call it chebu niebe in Senegal, and then it worked its way across the Middle Passage. You know, it leave the smoked and fermented fish and replace it with smoked and cured pork. You know, the dish evolved as it hit the coasts of, you know, in the low country rice kitchens of the Carolinas. And it's on New Year's, it's used because the black eyed peas symbolize coins, the collards symbolize cash, the rice symbolize fertility. But I think it's such an important dish as African Americans, telling the story of soul food as a migratory cuisine migrating from West Africa into the Americas and changing and, you know, being embraced by, you know, and actually being a dish that is distinctly African American in its ability to survive and thrive and still rest itself in like a tradition of New Year's Eve. But I think it's too important. It's way too good to be just enjoyed on New Year's. So it's always been on my menu in Cinque. In my version is a version that reflects the terroir and the abundance and the, you know, the envious farmers markets and purveyors of California. And it's a contemporary version of Hoppin' John. And I think that's also important because it's like dishes have to be, it's a migratory cuisine, soul food, as especially after the Great Migration. You know, you got people going into cities, those dishes from the South that were carried along over the seas from West Africa, they transformed as they hit different locations of the country.
Right.
And I think Hoppin' John should reflect contemporary Los Angeles. So that's why I do my version. But, you know, like I said, I think it's more important to be enjoyed on New Year's Eve. But it's also like, you know, if we think about what Juneteenth symbolizes, it symbolizes like a new beginning, and a moving forward. And doesn't New Year's Eve mean that, or New Year's mean that? Like, isn't that like, why not enjoy it on Juneteenth to you know, reflect back and gain encouragement and strength and pride in order to move forward. And you know, that same divination with the Black Eyed Peas, the right, like that symbolism aligns perfectly with red foods and red drinks. It's the same kind of symbolism, metaphor. It's poetic.
What's your special ingredient? Because you did give the recipe to the LA Times, and we're going to give a link to the recipe. So lots of folks have probably been cooking Hoppin' John on New Year's Day. There are lots of recipes in soul food books throughout, you know, any bookshelf or any bookstore. You find a soul food cookbook, you're probably going to find a Hoppin' John recipe. But obviously, Chef Ray, you've got a secret ingredient. What's the key to yours that makes it unique?
I can't take credit for the one that's in the LA Times one. It's my mother's recipe. And what she does is use cabbage instead of collard greens.
Okay.
And it was a funny story. Like, she didn't cook it, and I didn't have it until I was like a 14 years old, freshman in high school, when I brought my first girlfriend over to have dinner, and she whipped out this dish, and I was like, what is this? This is amazing. And she's like, it's Hoppin' John. And I was like, okay. But it had cabbage in it, and only later did I find that like the tradition is collard greens. So it's in the same family as the brassicas or cruciferous vegetables. So yeah, but I also use, instead of just bacon or ham hock, like I use, or she uses, I can't, it's my mom's recipe. I use bacon and ham, like country ham. So you've got like the crispiness and the really concentrated bacon flavor, but like that more like gentle, like tender ham. Yeah, so those are the variations.
Those are your mom's secret ingredients. So I know, Chef Ray, you said that you didn't grow up in a family. You grew up in a Black family in Kansas, Missouri, but it wasn't, your family didn't celebrate Juneteenth, didn't talk about Juneteenth. When did you first learn about Juneteenth and its historical significance?
I think I come from a fine art background, and I only recently I left fine art and went into food, and now I'm back doing fine art again with food. But the approach to an art project, a creative endeavor, always involves a stage of deep immersion and research. And you know, when I was going to make the shift to food, I just devoured as much information about Black food culture, Black food ways, African American cuisine, and you know, just trying to get acclimated with the terms. So I found out about it because I was looking at, June came around, and I really, instead of like, in Kansas City, our radio station was Hot 103 Jams, KPRS, and they always mention Juneteenth, like it's coming around. But I, like, as a kid, I was just like, okay, whatever. Like, get to the next song, like, you know. But like, as a cultural producer, my friend's dog.
It's live. That's all right, dog.
Yeah.
Dog.
As a cultural producer, I was I lost my train of thought. Oh,
You came into knowledge of Juneteenth as you immersed yourself in African American foods and traditions. So the answer to the question
yeah.
is you didn't really start thinking about it or knowing very much about it until you became an adult.
Yeah, they don't educate us about our like history. It's all whitewashed and, repackaged. Thanksgiving is like, even Thanksgiving is like, you know, it's this odd thing. It's a like, we're gonna celebrate the genocide of these people, like, by in their generosity, by consuming mass quantities of food. The story of Pocahontas, the Disneyfied story of Pocahontas. It's like the legacy of, you know just oppression is it makes sense because the victor writes the history almost,
Yeah.
or always, like. And there's this story, this parable that influenced, that I came across. My ex brought it to my attention, and she was like, it's a African proverb, and said, until lions have their own historians, the history will always glorify the hunt.
Mm, yeah.
So, as was said by the other guests on this program, it's like, we don't have to wait for permission. We have people. We have the ability to uplift and put out our own story. But the challenge is that internalized oppression, like valuing what white supremacists like symbols value, like assuming that because they say it's okay, we should really appreciate it. Like, when we learn to listen to our own leaders and culture producers, and value that, and not wait to see if the white majority is going to sign off on it, then we'll get somewhere.
Well, we've got to leave it there. Thank you so much, Chef Ray, for your recipe, your mom's recipe. Thank you for sharing your mom's recipe. I mean, it wouldn't be a good recipe if it didn't come from a mama. So, we know it's good because it came from your Black mama. So we're excited to try it. Thanks for the work that you're doing. Thanks for telling the story of African Americans through food and through the art that you do. Really a pleasure to meet you and sit down with you this morning. And thanks for representing Missouri. I love to meet fellow Missourians. So my best to you and Sing K Catering.
Thank you, Areva.
All right. I want to thank all of my guests this morning. So inspiring. This is edutainment. This is where we educate you and we entertain you because, that's the way most people receive their information. I want to thank all of you for your comments. The answers to my questions about Juneteenth were answered by Dr. Lindsay. She told you that it was Union Major General Gordon Granger that delivered the news about being freed to the 250,000 slaves that were in Galveston, Texas. Because there were no phones, there was no internet, there was no Federal Express, there was no way for those slaves that were in Texas to get the news. And that's how slowly news spread in those days. So it wasn't like the slaves were just sitting around being negligent. They literally didn't know the information until General Gordon Granger rode his horse into Galveston, Texas to deliver that news. And as much of a celebration as that news called for, and we saw African Americans in Texas and all over this country celebrating after the Emancipation Proclamation, after the 13th Amendment was passed, and after the official ending of slavery, we also saw the horrific and horrendous treatment of African Americans following, being freed by these new federal laws. We saw white plantation owners who were used to getting this free labor really retaliate and use violence against African Americans. So we saw the continued belief systems passed down from generation to generation that Blacks were inferior to whites. And we are today in 2021, as we are about to celebrate Juneteenth, still grappling in this country with the vestiges of slavery and the psychological impact that racism has on African Americans and all Americans. And one of the reasons we are commemorating Juneteenth is to acknowledge the continued pain that African Americans experience as a result of chattel slavery. And I want to thank Dr. Lindsay in particular for giving us that history of Juneteenth, the 101 on Juneteenth, because so many people continue to get the facts about that date wrong. So hopefully you will have a better understanding of why we are celebrating it and what the actual facts are of Juneteenth. Just some words to live by before I get out. Better late than never. Until a year ago, Juneteenth was one of the most obscure days on the calendar, despite the fact that it's been around since 1865 and despite the fact that millions of Blacks have been celebrating it for decades. Well, Biggie put it best when he said, if we didn't know, now we know. And since we do know now, it's important that we, and that means the collective, we, all of us, commemorate Juneteenth. And here are some ways to do it. Number one, you can order some food from a Black-owned restaurant. If you aren't, a cook, or you're not adventurous and you don't want to try Chef Ray's Hoppin' John recipe, you can support a Black-owned business, a Black-owned restaurant, a Black-owned catering company like the one that Chef Ray owns, and you can order food from that restaurant this weekend. You can also support a Black-led organization by making a financial donation. Mackenzie Scott, Jeff Bezos' wife, just donated billions of dollars to Black-led organizations fighting against discrimination. You don't have to have billions of dollars to make a donation. You can donate any amount, $20, $10. You can donate your time to an organization that's fighting discrimination and racism in this country. You can educate yourself and reflect on slavery and reflect on the impact and the aftermath of slavery. Spend Saturday, Juneteenth, reading about the true history of slavery and its impact on Black families throughout this country. You can, as I said earlier, watch the 13th documentary by Ava DuVernay. It is an outstanding story of the 13th Amendment. There are other online Juneteenth events that you can watch. You can share this story. You can share today's show, special report, with your online friends, because we have given you the complete history of Juneteenth. So you and your friends can watch this episode. You can educate yourselves about Juneteenth. Fifth, you can raise awareness. Decorate a sign. Get your kids involved. Do some art project with your kids and use that art project as a way to educate your kids. And if you have teenage kids who aren't into art, have them do a TikTok video about the history of Juneteenth where they can educate their followers about Juneteenth. And finally, you can write to your Congress member, because even though that legislation making Juneteenth a federal holiday was passed in the U.S. Senate, it has not passed in the U.S. Congress. So you can write to your congressional member urging them to vote on that Senate bill so that that bill will cross the desk of Joe Biden. He'll sign it, and Juneteenth will become a federal holiday. As I said at the beginning, better late than never. I'm out, y'all. Be safe out there. Remember, we are all in this together.